From a tube of stamped steel a Soviet machinist could knock out before lunch, to the smoking wreck of a multi-million-pound main battle tank in the Ukrainian tree line. 60 years and not a single decade off the job. It's in the hands of a Taliban fighter in the Hindu Kush. It's slung over the shoulder of a teenager in a pickup truck in Syria. It downed helicopters over Mogadishu. It led the Red Army in the Khyber. And right now today it is killing armor worth $10 million apiece with a round that costs less than a decent pair of boots. Every army hates it. Every army keeps a stack of them anyway. Today, the story of the most produced anti-tank weapon in human history, and why a design frozen in 1961 still turns up on every battlefield on Earth. I'm Tom Duggan, 20 years as a British Army armourer. If it was in service, I stripped it, fixed it, and signed it back out. Now I tell you what the manuals left out. Right, let's clear something up before we go a step further, because an entire generation grew up calling this thing the wrong thing. You know it as the RPG, rocket-propelled grenade. Sounds about right. There's a rocket, there's a grenade, job done. Except that's not what those three letters stand for. Not in the country that built it. In Russian, it's the Rushnoy Protivotankovy Granatomet, the handheld anti-tank grenade launcher. The RPG was never about the rocket at all. It was about what it was for, killing tanks, carried by one bloke on foot. Western journalists heard RPG, reverse engineered a name that fit, and the wrong one stuck for half a century. Any armourer who's handled the paperwork will tell you the same. Small thing, but it tells you everything about how this weapon got misunderstood, feared, and dismissed at the same time for 60 years. So picture the problem the Soviets were actually trying to solve, because this isn't a story about a wonder weapon. It's a story about poverty of resources met with genius of design. End of the Second World War, the infantryman has a problem that hasn't really changed since. There is a 30-ton steel monster coming over the ridge, and he is a man with a rifle. The Germans had answered it with a Panzerfaust, a one-shot disposable tube, fire it once, throw it away. Clever, cheap, but you got one go. The Soviets took that idea home as war booty and asked a better question: what if you didn't throw the tube away? What if one man could carry the launcher and a haversack of warheads and just keep feeding it? Reload, fire, reload, fire. The first crack at it was the RPG-2 in 1949, short-range, underpowered, a bit rubbish, if I'm honest. But the bones were right, and by 1961, the Design Bureau at Basalt had turned those bones into the thing we're actually here to talk about. Here's the one idea you need to understand, and once you've got it, the whole weapon falls open in your hands. The RPG-7 doesn't fire a rocket out of the tube. Not really. A small gunpowder charge, the booster, spits the grenade out at about 115 meters a second, slow and gentle enough that there's barely any recoil and not much backblast to give your position away at the moment of launch. Then, once it's cleared the tube by 10 meters or so, safely past the man who fired it, the sustainer rocket motor ignites and kicks it up to nearly 300 meters a second. 2 stages. A quiet shove, then a hard shove. That's why you can fire it from the shoulder without it taking your arm off. And why it reaches out the way it does, and up at the sharp end is the genius bit. A shaped charge, no kinetic energy, no need for speed on impact. It works by chemistry. A cone of copper lined inside the warhead, that on detonation collapses into a needle-thin jet of metal, moving at kilometers a second, and punches clean through 1/4 meter of steel. To put it another way, it's not hitting the tank, it's drilling it in a millionth of a second with a spike of liquefied copper. A poor country's answer to a rich country's armour. Now, a quick word, then I'll leave you be. Everything I've just told you about this weapon, the 2-stage motor, the shape charge physics, the procurement story behind it, and the bits the manual never printed, I've been keeping notes like these for 20 years on this weapon and every other one that ever went into service. A while back I finally sat down and put the lot into one place. A proper illustrated field manual, the full file on each weapon, written the way I'd explain it to you across the bench rather than the way the official pamphlet does. I call it the Armory Files. If today's story is the sort of thing you'd happily read 300 more of, the link's in the description. That's it. Back to the rifle. So it gets into service, and the West gets its first proper look at it in Vietnam. And this is where the thing earns its reputation. American armor, American helicopters, the most expensively equipped army on the planet. And the other side has a steel tube and a sack of warheads that any teenager can be taught to use in an afternoon. You don't need a maintenance depot. You don't need a power supply. You don't need to keep it clean, particularly. You could drag it through a rice paddy, bury it for a week, dig it up, and it'd still fire. That's the bit the spec sheet never captures, and it's the bit only someone who's stripped weapons for a living really feels. On the bench, most weapons fight you. Tight tolerances, fiddly gas parts, springs that ping off into the corner of the workshop. This thing is the opposite. There's almost nothing in it. Open it up, and you find a tube, a trigger group, a hammer, a sight. That's the lot. And a weapon with nothing in it is a weapon with nothing to go wrong. Let me give you the figures, because they're genuinely hard to believe. Best estimates put the number of RPG-7s built across the Soviet Union and the dozen-odd countries that licensed or simply copied it at north of 9 million. 9 million. To put that in scale, that's roughly one launcher for every person living in London, sat in armories and crates, and the boots of cars from Belfast to Kabul. The launcher itself, depending on where and when, has changed hands for as little as $100. The warheads mass-produced for 60 years, a similar story, call it $100 to $500 a round on the open market. And what does it kill? A modern main battle tank runs to $10 million. A helicopter, far more. So the maths of the battlefield, the maths that actually decides wars, looks like this, a few $100 versus 10 million. Even if it takes you 10 shots to get a hit, you are still trading at 1,000 to 1 in your favor. No quartermaster on earth turns down odds like that. Right, so it kills everything then? Well, no. And credit where credit's due, the tank designers weren't going to sit there and take it. The shaped charge jet has a weakness. It needs to detonate at exactly the right standoff distance, and it only drills a narrow channel. So the answer came in layers. First, reactive armor, bricks of explosive bolted to the outside of the tank that detonate outwards when the jet hits, disrupting it before it can bite. Then spaced armor, slat cages, the bar armor you'll have seen welded round vehicles like a garden fence, designed to catch the warhead and stop the nose fuse triggering at the right moment. For a while in the 80s, it looked like the tank had won the argument. The old RPG-7 round just couldn't get through. Except, and here's where a 60-year-old design refuses to die, they just changed the warhead. Same tube, same trigger, same bloke firing it. They designed the PG-7 VRA. Tandem warhead. Two shaped charges stacked nose to tail. The little one at the front sets off the reactive armor brick early, clears the way, and the big one behind it sails through the gap a fraction of a second later and does the actual killing. The genius of the original design, that you keep the cheap, indestructible launcher and only ever swap what's at the sharp end, meant the weapon could be upgraded for the cost of a new round, while the tank had to be re-engineered for the cost of millions. That's the whole war in miniature. The defender pays a fortune to stay ahead. The attacker pays pocket money to catch up, and it never, ever stops. And I've got to get serious for a minute, because it isn't all clever engineering. Mogadishu, 1993. Somali militia had been told American Black Hawk helicopters were untouchable. Too fast, too high. But someone worked out that if you wait under the tail rotor and fire upward, the back blast vents into open air and the warhead goes straight into the most fragile part of the airframe. Two Black Hawks came down that day to a weapon designed to kill tanks, improvised into killing aircraft. 18 American soldiers died. That's the thing about a weapon this simple and this everywhere. It doesn't stay in the role it was built for. It becomes whatever the man holding it needs it to be. And that's exactly why it leaked out of the battlefield and into everything else. It is the single most recognizable weapon in modern visual culture, and you've seen it 1,000 times without clocking it. Every news report out of every conflict zone since the 70s, that distinctive silhouette, the fat teardrop warhead on the end of a thin tube, every war film, every video game from Call of Duty to Battlefield hands it to you with that same satisfying one-punch streak. It's become visual shorthand for insurgency itself, the weapon of the underdog, the David that turns up to every fight against every Goliath. And the reason it's the shorthand is the reason this whole video exists. It really is on every battlefield. The films didn't invent that, they just noticed. Now, am I telling you it's perfect? No. Let me be fair to it, because that's the only way you'll trust the rest. It's not accurate that fat warhead catches a crosswind like a sail and past about 200 meters against anything that's moving, you're as much praying as aiming. The backblast will give your position away and injure anyone stood behind you, so you can't fire it from inside a room without deafening yourself. And against the very latest Western armor with its modern composite and active protection systems, even the tandem rounds struggle. It is, in cold terms, an area weapon used at point ranges by men who've learned to compensate. But here's the thing the spec sheet can't weigh. None of that matters when it's everywhere. It's cheap, it never breaks, and the other side only has to get lucky once. Which brings us to now. Ukraine, the most watched, most documented war of the modern age, fought with drones and satellite kit and weapons worth more than houses. And there in the mud, on both sides, the RPG-7. A 1961 design in a 2020s war, still doing exactly the job it was built for. Soldiers who weren't born when the Berlin Wall came down, firing a tube their grandfathers would recognize on sight. There is no other weapon on earth, not the rifle, not the machine gun, that has stayed in frontline, unmodified fight-deciding service for this long in this many hands on this many continents. It didn't survive because it's the best. It survived because it's the enough range, enough punch, enough simplicity, wrapped in a price tag that means anyone, anywhere can afford to keep a war going. So why is the RPG-7 on every battlefield on Earth? Because it's cheap enough that a militia can buy 100. Because it's simple enough that a farmer can learn it in an afternoon. Because it's tough enough to be buried, soaked, frozen, and still fire true. Because you only ever replace the round, never the weapon, so it upgrades for pocket money, while the tank it kills costs 10 million. And because 60 years on, nobody has built anything cheaper that does the job half as well. From a tube of stamped steel a machinist could knock out before lunch to the smoking wreck of a tank in a Ukrainian tree line. The most produced anti-tank weapon in history isn't a museum piece. It's still out there right now being loaded, and it isn't going anywhere. Right. Settle an argument for me in the comments. I reckon the RPG-7 is the most influential weapon of the last century. Full stop, more than any rifle. Tell me I'm wrong, and tell me which weapon you'd put above it. I read every comment, and the most requested one I'll do next. If you got something out of this, you know what to do. Like it, subscribe, and I'll see you at the bench next week. I'm Tom Duggan. Mind how you go.